Welcome. Today we are going to be talking about reading stories, particularly the Genesis stories, the people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, stories that you would find in your Bible from Genesis 12 to Genesis 50. Now, obviously, we're not going to be talking about every chapter, every person, but what we will be talking about will be ways that you can read these stories that will enrich your reading of the story, that will help you to better encounter the story, that will help in understanding how these stories are written, what kinds of things to be looking for, to be reading for, and some sense of themes and flows in these stories. So, let's just get started. Today we'll kind of focus on just approaching a biblical story, and the things that we talk about reading stories will have wider application certainly than just reading Genesis stories. So you'll be able to use these kinds of things, and I'll be reminding you as we go along. You'll be able to use these kinds of tools in reading a number of biblical stories. First of all, as you know, the Bible reveals the mission of God. He is a God who is pursuing, He is a God who is on mission. And the Bible has certainly a number of ways that it can reveal God on mission. And one of those ways, certainly, one we're talking about today, is the fact that stories help us to see what God's mission is about. They help us to see how God works on mission, through whom He is working, how He relates to the world, how people figure into that. So it's very interesting that although this might sound very simple and sound like something we have known for a long time, it's easy to forget that when we open the Bible and when we encounter stories, we are reading stories that the writers have chosen to reveal to us what God is doing and how God is on mission. Now, in times to come or in future sessions, we'll certainly see that there are a number of ways in which God can reveal His mission to us. It's not just confined to stories, and we'll be exploring those, but just as a kind of foundational and beginning piece with the bulk of the Genesis stories, just as a reminder that this is a God who is on mission. And story form is a great way for the story of God's mission to be told. Now, don't let this be confusing to you. We've kind of talked about it a little in a previous session. Stories themselves can be historical or non-historical. In other words, a story can be told about a true person in a true place, in actions that actually happened at a particular time and day. Stories can also be non-historical in the sense that stories are told and they could be, let's say, applicable in a number of situations. They might be imaginative. They may use other features in the story that kind of alert us to the reality that this particular story is not historical. That is not intended to diminish in any way the value of stories, whether they are historical or non-historical. In whatever way a writer presents God's redemptive activity or shares with us God's redemptive mission. The truth of God's mission, the reality of what God is doing, is not less or more, depending upon whether it is historical, a particular story is historical in its posture, or whether it is non-historical or has features about it that let us know that this story is not just a historical story. Writers can use a variety of ways to help us to see and realize God's mission. So please keep in mind that these beautiful stories, powerful stories, are told primarily so that we can begin to see that God is on a mission, and what kind of God is on that mission, and what kind of mission that God is on. Stories also are invitations. Everybody loves to listen along to a great story. When we hear great stories or see them in whatever ways we do, we're reading, we're talking to somebody, we're watching a movie, whatever way, there's something that is certainly captivating about stories themselves. And good stories have the power to invite us into the story. So as you are reading these biblical stories, let me encourage you to be open to the reality that what God is doing in these stories is inviting you to be part of the story, to be part of the story as it would impact our life. Let me return, I think I may have used earlier, but just a beautiful way, at least for me, to envision this. In the Chronicles of Narnia that many of us have probably have seen, the Da Vinci children moved out of London. They are staying with a family member, and there's a large room, there's a large armoire piece of furniture in that room, and Lucy, the youngest of the children, opens the door, goes through it, and by going into the wardrobe, she actually ends up in the land of Narnia. The Bible is not just something that invites you to stand and we hold it up and present it and we describe it and we give a lot of analytical data about the Bible. That stuff certainly is very important. But ultimately, when we open up the Bible and we enter into its story, it's very much like the experience of Lucy as she enters the wardrobe. We are entering the story of the kingdom of God. So there's an invitation in the stories. There are also levels of stories, and sometimes we miss this because we, in our understanding that the Bible is fully inspired, that all of the Bible is inspired, sometimes that translates into us thinking that everything that is in the Bible, although all inspired, that everything is of equal significance or of equal weight or of equal importance. Well, that's just not the case. There are some things in the Bible that are far more significant than other things. That does not mean one thing is more inspired than another thing, or one thing is more biblical than another thing. So we see some of this in stories. So as you start reading stories, let's do it this way. Let's consider levels of stories, and the upper level would be what we will call, and you've encountered this word before, a meta-narrative. This simply means, or refers to, God's story, the big story of God. Addresses issues like who is God, what is God doing, this redemptive mission that we have been talking about. And so there is God, what is he like, why does he care, why has he created, what is he doing, why is he doing what he's doing, what's going to be there. This whole thing of God has a story. And so when we are reading the Bible, there is clearly the meta-narrative position that some stories help us to engage at that level and address those kinds of issues. Then there is, just for sake of making it easy, we'll call the mid-level. And in the mid-level, this will be stories about God's people, the covenant, and as we explore in sessions to come, as we kind of unpack these a little more, we will see particularly a number of stories, obviously, about God's people. And we'll be encountering people, and then ultimately that story, as time goes on, will turn into God's people as being a nation and so forth. So anyway, the mid-level of stories focus on God's people, God's covenant, and certainly how that relates to God himself in the larger story. And then the lower level of story will be, we'll just call them things like street stories. In the sense that they are stories that might add some understanding to what's happening here. They are stories that might add some detail, or in which we might be able to clarify or to see more clearly what God is doing here. So you can probably see that when you begin reading the stories, that there are just going to be some stories that are upper range kinds of stories about God. And then there are going to be mid-level type stories featuring God's people, things like keeping his covenant, how to be in relationship, how to keep relationship with God. And then there are going to be a number of lower stories that kind of swirl around these stories, and in some sense might help us to see a little more about what is happening in these stories. So, as you begin reading, please start thinking in terms of these levels of stories, and keep in mind that once you start making decisions, this story is a God's people story. You can see that this story belongs right here, and maybe you see, well, this story is a helpful story, interesting story. It broadens my knowledge. It gives me some insight on this story. But you can begin to see that these stories can survive without this. Again, please keep in mind that we are not saying in any way that stories along any one of these paths or in any one of these levels are less inspired. Fully inspired, totally revealed by God's Spirit. It's just that this is the nature of stories. So now you're beginning to see that stories just don't fly on an even path. Maybe this would help in some way. There are stories that help us to take off. There are stories that take us to the highest path or the highest point of the flight, and then there are stories that help us to land. And if you can see stories as serving in various functions and begin to see them in the particular kinds of roles that they play, it will help us to see more of the contours of the story so that we don't flatline the stories of the Bible. We see that some are very significant in this way, and others serve these kinds of purposes and help you to identify which stories are where, why those stories are there, and how any and all of those stories, in what ways they reveal to us what God wishes to speak to us. So I hope that is a way that will help add some texture to you reading stories. Another thing I want to talk about with stories is that stories in the Bible are primarily theological. And we have talked about this in terms of previous stories that we saw in Genesis from the Garden of Eden and beyond that. So the same thing is true now that we come to stories like Abraham and beyond, that their primary purpose, although we do get a sense as we read it that Abraham is certainly a historical figure, and he lives in real time, and he lives in real space, and he has a real family, and he's moving along the map, and God has really given him a call and given him a promise, and all of the stories that go with that it is ultimately a theological message that is conveyed through the stories. So even though these stories will certainly have a high sense of historicalness about them, and we can see them as being a place, time and date and people and event and circumstance and plot and all those kinds of things, that they are still stories which lead us primarily to theological realizations or theological truths or theological realities. So as you're reading these stories, keep in mind, we are not approaching them or reading them in the sense of a strict historian. We're reading them because these are stories of our faith. And as stories of our faith, they come from perspectives of faith, and they speak to people of faith, and they speak about matters of faith. So in that sense, these stories are shaped and they are told with a lot of theological measure to them, a lot of theological input. So read the stories and keep in mind that they are theological. They speak to us about God. They speak to us about mission. They speak to us about life. They speak to us about covenant. And they speak to us about relationships, all those kinds of things. Also keep in mind that the thrust, and we've alluded to it earlier, the thrust of the stories are to help us to realize what God's mission is in the world. So as you're reading stories, keep in mind that first of all, whatever story you're reading is pointing us to, revealing to us something of God and of His mission in the world. And not only just particular stories, we have a tendency, and sometimes I guess it's something of a necessity we do this story and that story, and I know, it's just the way life is. We have to live in history ourselves and in time frames. But as you read the stories, keep in mind as well that as stories that are theological and stories that help us to see God on mission, that these stories connect with each other, and there are things larger than the story itself that each of the stories bring to or help to propel what God is doing. So try in as much as possible, and I know it's hard to do, try not to just compartmentalize or frame out each story as a standalone story. There's a sense in which these stories are highly connected, they relate to each other, and we see themes and threads that we might find in one story, and we see that being worked out in maybe subsequent stories, or when we back up, we might see that it was present in previous stories, and we begin to see some of the beauty and the artistry and the way that these stories reveal and convey what God is doing. So, read these stories and begin then to see stories, the smaller stories, begin to see them in terms of the large story, a story, and see that in terms of God's mission. And finally, let me mention to you, and again, this is not anything we really haven't said in so many words before, that the purpose is for us to have to encounter a life-giving God in a life-shaping story. These stories are intended to invite us in and not only to give us clarity, but to begin to do something in us so that we are transformed by being part of the story, by being in the story, and God is able to more so work through what He is accomplishing through us or through our faith community, and the stories become a place where God's purposes of shaping people's lives begins to happen as we are called into this life-shaping story, and we encounter a living God. So, having said all of that, let me mention several things that all of us see as fairly popular and very prevalent concerning stories, and this might halt you just a little bit, stop you in your tracks just for a moment, but I think you'll see where it's going, and we'll be fine with it. The primary purpose of narratives and the primary purpose of stories is not to do these things I see it all the time. The primary purpose is not to, for example, just give us principles to live by. There are a number of very valid principles that can be certainly drawn from stories, but the stories are not there just to give us principles. They're not there just to offer propositions about truth. They're not there just to give precepts about life. They're not there just to provide lessons. I mean, this one's a pretty big one. A lot of us kind of grew up in cultures where the way that we talked about the Bible was that there's a lesson there. Now, the lessons are innumerable. So I hope that doesn't confuse you, but the purpose of the Bible is not just to invite you into the story or to invite you into the text regardless of where it is. It's not just to give lessons about life. That is a residual kind of effect. So don't or resist, I should say, the temptation to think in terms just of Bible lessons as if the primary purpose of the Bible is to just give lessons. It's not. It's bigger than that. It's more beautiful than that. It's more personal than that. It's more transforming than that. Certainly, there will be a number of lessons along the way. So I hope you can just kind of digest that a little bit, especially if you, like most of us, are used to thinking of the Bible or accustomed to an approach of the Bible which basically reads stories or reads a section of Scripture and draws out the principles from it, or looks at a story or looks at a particular piece of Scripture as if its only and ultimate purpose is so that you can look at it and figure out what the principles are, what the propositions are, or what the precepts are, or what the lessons are. So, or even in there is a lot of doctrinal stuff in the Bible. But when you're reading a story, let me just suggest to you to think about not reading it just so that you can, after reading it, thinking about it, digesting it, it's not just there so that you can create doctrine from it. Does doctrine come from story? Yes, they do. But again, it's not the primary purpose of this story. However, I'm not seeking in any way to minimize the value and how we come about doctrine, not doing that in any way whatsoever. Just trying to challenge us to realize that stories invite us into life-changing encounters with a life-changing God. And doctrine comes out of it, lessons, I know all these things come out of it. But don't make that just the aim. Let's do it this way, maybe that's helpful. Don't make these kinds of things the target. They will certainly come. So, I hope that will be helpful in some way with this. As we particularly get to Genesis and just start kind of an Abraham thing in just a moment, let me also just remind you of a couple things not to do. I actually meant to put this on the stuff that we were just doing, but when you're reading the stories, don't try to moralize everything. Is there morality in the Bible? Yes. Just like there's doctrine, just like there are lessons. Sometimes we tend to make the mistake of reading the stories in the Bible just so that we can draw out moral principles. And sometimes we do the same thing. We try to spiritualize stories in the Bible. And that can be a difficult temptation to resist. They're not there just so that we can, put a spiritual type of spin on them. And they're not there just so they can be individualized. So here again are some things that are common kinds of things that we bring to the Bible, we bring to stories. And again, It doesn't mean there isn't morality. It doesn't mean there's not spiritual thing. It doesn't mean there aren't things that are about individuals or speak to us individually. Resist the temptation, however, to make this your front line approach to the story itself. Don't make this the big lens that you're going to read a story just to see what you can bring out of that or draw out of that story with morality or with spirituality, or trying to individualize the story so it's just about you or somebody else particularly. Now, from there, let's go to Abraham. And as we go to Abraham, since we're pretty much at the end of today's session, and this can be a lot of stuff to try to think about and reflect on and, kind of work through and perhaps even struggle through for your own experience of coming to the Bible. Let me just mention two things to note about Abraham, and this applies throughout the rest of Genesis. First of all, and this is just a theme that you might want to put on your radar. Make sure that you're picking up on this. Throughout the stories, Genesis 12 to 50, notice how much of those stories are happening along journeys. I mean, you get the clear picture that we are truly pilgrims, and God is speaking to Abraham over here, and Abraham's going to pick up his stuff and move up on the map. And for example, in Genesis chapter 12 alone, or actually beginning with the end of chapter 11, Abraham moves from Ur to Haran to Canaan to Egypt because of the famine, back to Canaan. All of that happens in a fairly short span of text time. And you get a clear sense that there's going to be a high level of journey. So as you, for this week, as you're reading through chapter 12, look for this theme, and you'll be able to identify it easily and readily enough. But also begin to start thinking about this theme of journey. What is its theological message? What does it say about God? What does the very fact that there's so much journey going on here, what does it say about God's people? And those are very appropriate kinds of things to begin to pursue. The other thing that you will see in Genesis 12 as you read is covenant. God has called Abraham, and he's got a promise out to him, and as you read chapter 12, you'll hear the echoes of the promise that God will make him a great nation, and that he will be a blessing, and all those things. And that begins in chapter 12. In future sessions, I'll remind you about that, and we'll see how that covenant kind of promise appears often, and appears in various ways to various people along the way. And just maybe as almost kind of a fun thing, but again, a very deeply spiritual thing about doing this. As you start reading the stories, and let me invite you to kind of back up to the end of chapter 11 for this week, and begin reading about verse 27, chapter 11, verse 27. We have the story of one of the sons of Noah, whose oldest son was Shem, and then there's a genealogy. We've talked about genealogies. And at the end of chapter 11, you'll get something of a sense of that. And out of that genealogy of Shem will come Abraham or Abram. And as you are reading along, and as you think about the journey that people in the story are going to take, and as you think about the covenant, and as you think about the promise, and as you think about the blessing, this would be a really interesting thing for you to consider doing. Start making a list of all of the things that you encounter, that you read about in this story, that pose a threat to the journey. How is it that this journey, for example, is such a high-risk journey? Why is it that they are on a journey? What's happening on that journey? And then think about this covenant. I think covenant is the big deal. It's going to go all the way through the rest of the biblical story. Think about it, and you'll see them, some of them will just leap right off the page and grab you. Start looking at the many ways in which the covenant itself is at risk, or is threatened, or perhaps is endangered, or is certainly challenged. And to get you started, I'll just give you one so that you'll kind of have a heads up on what you're looking for. At the end of chapter 11, when we are introduced to Abraham's wife, Sarah, there is a brief statement about her that is made, which simply says that she was barren, or she was without child. So I won't unpack that any further. I'll let you do that. But when you read that statement, look at how that impacts, what that means to things particularly like the covenant. And then in our next session, we'll pick up on some of these, and we'll see how they actually weave their way into the larger story. So I hope you have a very meaningful journey yourself into the stories as we start getting into them, and that you'll be able to use some of the kinds of things that we are sharing together to enrich your encounter of God's story.